Chapter 17. "Are you putting me on trial?" Vlad roared. His voice echoed in the cramped throne room. The Kelin king leaned away from the spittle, glancing sideways at the obsidian mirror. He wished not to look at Vlad, but the commander's reflection was all he saw. He tightened his jaw. "No, not as such, but something unimaginable happened on your watch, so you must be held accountable. 7 of us died." Vlad paced in tight circles. "I was overseeing the capture of the Kelvar. A pen got loose. In such tight quarters, be thankful that only 4 soldiers fell." He stopped pacing and picked at a deep scratch he'd received from one of the beasts. Dis leaned forward. He found that he was drumming his fingers. "And 7 of us are dead. 3 by these humans." He glanced at the mirror again and watched his face, as if reassuring himself that he was still here. He knew Kelin would perish in this campaign, but none so close to him as this. It didn't matter, his reflection told him. They had more than enough bodies. Dark Rain only had so much space, after all. 7, Vlad. 7 of us." The commander held up 3 fingers. The king squirmed in his seat. "She's human. Well, mostly." All the thunder rumbled back onto the commander's face. "We were once too." The king tightened his grip on his armrest. "We make no mention of that." "It doesn't change the truth, Dis." He began to pace again. "And losing the princes has set us back. If you do not remember so well, it was I who orchestrated this war." Dis breathed out. He looked at the mirror again. It was all right. He turned to the commander. "Yes, and your brilliant strategy seems to involve many people escaping us. First, both the princes. Then you lost the crown prince again in the human city. I'm surprised you killed the king and queen." Vlad stiffened. "None of that has damaged my plan. It is merely delayed." "What?" The Kelin king pressed his hands together. "You don't think the elves won't use this time you've given them? They cannot stab a ghost." Vlad slammed his boot down. "They run in panic, which buys us time. They can do nothing, and soon they will realize how helpless they are. That is the moment I will savor." The king continued to scowl. But he believed the commander. The Kelin could always rely on one another. It was their race against the entire world. Their unity was the one thing that staved off extinction after what the elves had done to them. It had brought them life, then peace, and now they could have their vengeance at last. Despite how much Vlad left a nasty taste in his mouth, he knew he could trust him with his life. He had to. His fingers slid across his identical Calver scratch, even though he had been near no beasts. They'd been bound by an ancient magic, but it was no matter, he had always told himself, because they carried the same purpose. They all had. Every one of them. Dis avoided looking at the commander's face. He coughed, and then cleared his throat. "When do you continue your hunt for the princes?" "In the morning." "Morning?" Dis's voice weighed heavily. Vlad gritted his teeth. "My experiments continue." "Are you still trying to enchant that noisemaker? This is urgent. It is not a noisemaker, it is the absence of sound." He pointed at the wall toward the west. "It will pound fear into their hearts. They remember." His tone slowed, and he snarled, "As if you aren't experimenting and scheming on your own. For the betterment of all of us. I don't want to lose a hand for all of time." Dis ran his fingers over his face. "The sword was lost, Vlad. Do not lose yourself, too. We have victories to march toward. This is just another element of my plan. With that, he spat at the king's feet and marched out of the room. Dare stared blankly at the half-circle of elves. She counted 5 of them on one long, simply crafted bench. She guessed they must have made it out here in the wild lands. But why? Then again, all of her thoughts seemed to be a distance from her. At least the sun had come out, she observed as she shaded her eyes. The humans weren't bound or chained, but they understood the consequences of trying to escape. Next to her, Kelin was clenching and unclenching his fists, and shifting his weight from side to side. Each symmetrical face before them was etched in stone. There were 3 men and 2 women. 2 of them were wearing steel, including the Red Knight. She sighed and slouched. She had always wanted to meet elvish knights, but now she wished she could postpone the introduction. She couldn't decide on any ages for them. They looked young, but every time she tried to think of years, the number just fell away. She knew she was staring. The women were the most beautiful people she had ever seen. One had dark hair which went well past her waist, and she shone in a dress that sparkled and shimmered, like sunlight playing on a mountain lake. Dare didn't get a good look at the blonde woman before she caught the glare of the male elf seated in the center. He wore an emerald-embroidered shirt and dark trousers. His collar was turned up, and unlike the others, he glowered at her and Kelin with eyes burning so brightly they could have started a fire. A chilly wind swept through, teasing leaves across the forest floor. Dare felt her throat dry. The Red Knight rose to his feet. He seemed even more massive, away from the horse. She thought that elves were supposed to be petite, svelte, and all those other things, like Caleb had been. This one wasn't. This one looked like an ancient oak. A strong jaw and stern features defined his face, which was set against short, clipped blonde hair. His ears appeared to stick out farther than the others because of his haircut. His pale blue eyes glared down at them. "I am Sir Jacob, Knight Captain of the Silver Dawn Dragoons. Since this is a time of war, if you are found guilty of aiding the enemy, your lives will be forfeited, just like the man left behind at your camp. So now, you will tell us your tale of how you came to be here, and this council will tell you what we believe. Then we shall have a discussion. Introduce yourselves before you speak. I will admit that this is anything but a proper trial. However, this needs to be done and done quickly. Is this all understood?" Kelin stepped forward and bowed. He never fully raised his head and instead gazed intently at the ground.
"Lords and ladies, I am Kelin Miller, and this is Derora Saxen, both of River's Bridge."
He licked his lips.
"Actually, that should be Lady Derora Saxen of River's Bridge, of the noble house of Saxen of Theolith."
The elves stared impassively. Dare whispered, "I wouldn't have said that."
"I know,"
Kelin hissed. The neatly dressed elf in the center cleared his throat. He sharpened his glare on them. There shouldn't even be a trial at all. The Knight Captain returned a blank but stern look to the other elf.
"Dragoon law, sir. They have to have a trial because they have no allegiance to speak for them."
Dare frowned. "Where's Thalin? You know, the boy?" The dark-haired female elf shook her head. "Child, no questions now." Dare shook her head right back. "You didn't kill him, did you?" Gasps circled throughout the council.
"Your life will be ended if you don't obey the rules of this trial,"
the cleanly dressed elf snapped. "So please, go right ahead." She scowled up at him. "Then I'd like to go to my grave knowing you didn't murder a child." His upper lip rose, but before he could speak, the other elven woman raised a hand as smoothly as flowing silk. Her sapphire eyes appeared sympathetic. They also shone oddly, even at this distance, but Dare couldn't make out any detail in them. Strawberry blonde curls caressed her cheeks. Her dress was simple, unlike the other female elves, and it revealed her beauty without drawing attention to itself. "The child is well." Her voice was the sound of bells singing in the wind, and Dare flushed in sheer wonderment of it. It wasn't just musical, it was a full symphony. She and Kelin just stared. They were helpless. They couldn't have even run for their lives after hearing her speak. The elf in the center turned his glare onto her, but she didn't seem to notice. She coaxed, "Tell us your story, please." Kelin bit his lip. Dare shrugged. "Like back at the village? Where do you want us to start?" The Red Knight and the graceful elf exchanged a glance. She nodded slightly. Sir Jacob returned his gaze to the pair and said,
"Think of this from our perspective. We find you out here in the wildlands with a murdered elf not 5 miles away and with a child of mixed heritage. Why are you here? What events led you to be out here with this boy?"
Dare opened her mouth, but the elf in the center scoffed,
"If they will not tell us, then let us not waste our time."
Dare glowered up at him. "We met them after we escaped from the Kemen." No one moved in the silence that followed. The Red Knight blinked.
"Excuse me?"
"Laurel saved our lives," Dare breathed. "She's the elf who died. But she said that she couldn't do enough for me, not after what the Kemen had done, and then Senna's cultists attacked." An argument exploded among the elves in a language Dare and Kelin did not understand. The elf in muted armor held up his hand and spoke in common.
"We are agreed. No questions. This is protocol."
He looked back at the humans.
"Continue?"
Dare shrugged. "Well, we met your prince in Dulangar. Caleb." She heard the strain, heard words humming on the other side of their lips, but there were no more outbursts. The dark-haired woman tilted her head. "There are no princes named Caleb." The knight in muted armor said,
"He wouldn't have used any name that we would recognize."
The elf in the center scowled at them.
"You can't believe they actually met—" Kelin started. "The Kemen used their spies to hunt for him, calling him an outlaw, and we took his place in a trap."
"And that doesn't matter," Dare yelled. "None of this matters. We didn't know who he was or where he was going, but Laurel, she knew something really important. We don't know what it was, though, so you're out of luck." She shrugged as she glanced around. "That's it. I'm done." The neatly dressed elf in the center snorted.
"Very well. I am Duke Farallon of the Aeolian Plateau, sworn to the royal family of Indeleria." He glowered at them with nothing but disdain. "Your story is outrageous. I don't believe it."
The elf in muted armor inclined his head.
"I am Sir Amthros, Knight of Indeleria, sworn to the royal family. We were passing through the Altis domain, or wildlands as you say, on our return to Indeleria. We were forced to evacuate our nobility and leaders after the murders of the king and queen. During our passage, we learned of the outlaw ruse and suspected that the missing prince may have been nearby. We discovered ourselves to be on the path of devil worshippers, who had been driven out of the city to avoid execution. They were exposed when blood was publicly spilled."
The dark-haired woman beside him spoke. "I am the Duchess of the Aeolian Plateau, Lady Sabiel." She nodded at Duke Farallon. "So it seems that the cultists murdered the elf whom you knew. But you, in your haste, escaped us." Dare gasped. It hadn't been more cultists on horseback. It had been the elves. She rubbed her neck as she wondered. If they'd been caught back at the camp instead of near the unicorns, would it have made any difference? The Duchess frowned at them. "And you claim the Kemen have tortured you with only light marks on the both of you?"
"No."
The Duke snapped his fingers.
"It's far more likely that they are in league with our enemy, either the cultists or bought by the storm readers." Dare inhaled sharply. Kelin stamped down on her foot before she could say anything. He held up a warning finger. She snorted, but kept her mouth closed. The Duke sneered and leaned forward. "You have been agents all along. You tried to lead the prince to his death, and while you failed with that, you succeeded with the elf in the forest." Dare's jaw dropped. Kelin flinched. Sir Amthros raised a hand. "That is not the consensus of this council. Perhaps they were unwitting agents." Sir Jacob nodded. "Yes, and there is the child." Duke Farallon shook his head. "Surely the poor woman was taken against her will." "The Kemen have never—" Sir Amthros began, and then silenced himself. Dare poked up her hand. No." "You're not allowed to speak." Lady Sabiel stared down her nose at them. "Your part of the discussion is closed." Dare jabbed a finger at the Duke. "But he's getting it all wrong, and you spoke during our half. I listened to the way Laurel spoke about her husband. She loved him, and he was away from her side spying for information for you when she was killed." "You're not allowed to speak," Duke Farallon roared. "Even if you were, good sense does not allow us to trust you." The graceful elf inclined her head to the Duke. "She's not lying." He gritted his teeth. "It doesn't matter. She doesn't know the truth. She just knows what she believes." He swept his hand out toward them. "And she believes that this elf and a Kemen had a loving partnership. Do I have to explain this to you?" "Then what about Fallon?" Dare yelled. Farallon whirled on her. "You may not speak. That's enough. We will carry the rest of these proceedings in our language." He curled his upper lip. "Not that it will make a difference." Sir Amthros shook his head. "That is not tradition. Everyone must hear, especially the accused." "They'll still understand. She'll just translate." "Translate what?" Dare lifted an eyebrow. Stony silence answered her at first, but then a murmur spread through the elves. Dare leaned back toward Kelin. "I don't think we're reading from the same book here. I mean, elves are supposed to be arrogant, but to expect that we know their language? Are they serious?" He shrugged. Lady Sabiel slipped in a few words in their language, and another intense argument erupted. They bickered for some time before finally turning back with upset faces. Most of them looked at Dare, as if waiting for her to speak. She and Kelin exchanged shrugs. "You don't know?" Sir Jacob asked in the dumbfounded silence. "You don't speak our tongue?" the Duchess queried, staring hard at Dare. Dare snorted. "Obviously not." Silence floated on the air, and no one on the council moved for a moment. The graceful elf leaned forward. "Do you not know your heritage?" "Yes, I do. My family's from Riversbridge, parents from Second Akron." The elf smiled softly. "You are part elven. Most likely 1/16, which isn't much at all, but most other people like you still know our language." Dare's eyes shot wide, and she retreated a step only to trip over a root, falling hard on her tailbone. She didn't notice. She gaped up at the judges. "That's a nasty joke." "The truth, little one." She fired her gaze at Kelin, who looked as shocked as she was. He offered her a hand up. "Not true," she muttered, reaching for her head. I have rounded ears." "With noticeable, notches. And you have the cheekbones." Jacob shifted in his seat. Push your hair back." She complied. The rear top corner of her ear was slightly pointed, but the ear still rounded over it. She ran a finger over them, but felt nothing special. Kelin offered a sympathetic smile. "It's not a bad thing, Dare." "Then why didn't the prince say anything?" Sir Amthros's face twisted. possibly because the way your hair is and his recent trauma could have clouded his mind.
Duke Farallon threw up his hands. So much for protocol. I suppose now it is discourse. We are still having a trial here, my lords and ladies.
Sir Jacob nodded stiffly.
Yes, we are. Now, I would like to hear the details of how they engineered their escape. That is the most elusive part of their tale for me.
Dare still rubbed the tips of her ears.
What? Oh, right.
Beside her, Kelin looked up to the night with red-ringed eyes.
They took my teeth.
He grabbed his chest over his lung. Wheezing, he stumbled through the tale of their rescue. He stuttered,
And it happened, lords, it did, that a Kebid helped us escape. Oh, right. Then they met this other elf whom none of us know, the Duke exclaimed. Does anyone honestly believe this?
Sir Jacob shrugged, but his gaze remained trained on Dare.
Did he even give you a name? Or did Laurel?
They shook their heads. He had just been the Kemen who aided them.
Were there any sentries or guards he instructed you to avoid?
Dare frowned. I killed the one we came across, like Kelin said. Why were you not recaptured by the Storm Readers after your escape? The Duchess asked.
I don't know, my lady.
Kelin bowed his head. Dare frowned. I remember Laurel saying something about asking the forest to hide us, but I don't understand what she meant. Forest sanctuary, the strawberry blonde elf replied. If she hadn't been expecting any humans, she would have asked the forest to obscure them from only Kemen, which would have strained her and the forest less. This would explain how the cultists got through.
Farallon snarled, They're not even wounded. Not by the Kemen, at least. Maybe by those cultist lowlifes.
Come now, my Lord Duke, coached the Duchess. Healing salves have saved many a mortal wound. He snorted.
Perhaps, wife, but they do not behave as if they'd been tortured. I've seen the results of what the Kemen have done to men. Good, seasoned warriors. People who have survived the Kemen are afraid of their own shadows, and yet these two mortals walk away smiling.
I am not smiling. Dare balled a fist and stepped forward. I am dying. She struggled for balance. Her wounds felt as though they had been dipped in acid anew. The Duke growled and shook his head.
Don't you see it? They were made to escape. They're agents of the Kemen, so they need to die.
Sir Amthros raised his hand.
Perhaps, but they appear not to know. If they are unaware, then they are innocent as far as this trial is concerned. If they are, they're stupid. A Kemen would never aid an elf, Farallon snapped. The story makes no sense.
The knight continued.
I agree that elements of their tale don't fit with what we know of the Storm Readers, but that doesn't mean they are guilty of aiding the enemy. But they're mortals! She didn't even know her heritage! The Duke spat.
Let us not resort to personal attacks, Sir Amthros advised. But it is personal. Dare jerked her thumb at her throat. It's our necks! For a brief instant, she thought she saw Sir Jacob's mouth quirk.
Yes, that is true,
the Knight of Indaleria admitted.
But where's the evidence of your tale?
I'm not lying.
I never accused you of that.
Oh. She deflated. Farallon slapped his knee with a loud crack.
The clever bastards! Their escape was impossible. They let them go. They could be watching us right now. It's why they didn't capture them in the forest.
The Kemen have no traitors, the Duchess declared. If they met one that helped them, it was only to further their endgame. But they had a child, Dare pleaded. That doesn't make sense either, according to your story.
It doesn't matter,
the Duke shouted. He looked to the rest of the council.
Even if they are unwitting, they still could be a danger to us. This is war, my lords and ladies.
Sir Jacob's face was stern, a perfect mirror of his tone of voice.
Their story may or may not be true. Alas, they have no one to vouch for them. Dare said, "The prince can." Everyone stared at her, including Kelin and especially Duke Farallon. She glanced around. "What?" She raised both of her eyebrows. "We know him, so he could—" Farallon coughed. "How dare you suggest that?" "Would you stop interrupting me?" She glared. "He was my friend, all right? And I want to ask after my friend." As everyone watched, the Duke's face metamorphosed into a brilliant shade of red. He gasped as if he had just emerged from drowning. "Do you not understand that you are on trial for your wretched life?" She took a deliberate step toward him. "Oh? Because it sounds to me that you've already decided." She felt herself teetering on the edge of a cliff. "You call this a trial? Out here in nowhere? I admit that I don't know much, but it seems to me, my lord, that you don't either." She had stumbled over the precipice and found that she could fly. "This little theater show of a trial ain't what's important." She looked around to all the judges. "What's important is saving Caleb's life." She glared at the Duke. "So if you're in such a rush, just get this trial over with and move along." Kelin slammed his hand over his mouth. "There!" In the silence that shook the forest around them, Sir Amthros nodded to her. Another intense conversation in Elvish shot off like an arrow. An eerie sensation flowed by them as they listened. No one shouted, but everyone spoke urgently, and they seemed to take equal turns. Kelin grabbed her arm. "You guard that tongue. You may be dying, but the worst can still happen to me." Her mouth hung open. She shifted her weight. "You'll be all right." "They may not decide that, and I don't want to repeat this trial in front of the gods, all right?" The argument stopped. The elves turned back to face them. The knight captain's tone was tempered with patience. "You have not lied." Dare watched his gaze slide over to the graceful elf. He continued, "Your tale is strange, and a larger truth may yet be found, but for now your lives will be spared. You both are prisoners of the Order of the Silver Dawn Dragoon Knights." Kelin sagged with relief, and Dare managed to exhale. She faced the judges. "Laurel was trying to find you. All of this is out of your influence. Take what we give you." She shook her head. "This isn't justice." "You're right," the knight captain replied. "It's war.